Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for your attention. My name is Gideon Long. I'm the Andean correspondent for the Financial Times. I'm based in Colombia. A warm welcome to this FT Live event, which has been organized by the Financial Times in collaboration with Millicom, a leading provider of fixed and mobile telecoms services to Latin America, where it operates under the Tigo brand name. Our thanks to Mauricio Ramos, the CEO of Millicom. Great to have you here. We'll be hearing from Mauricio shortly. Just to run you quickly through the program, after we've heard from Mauricio, I will be interviewing our distinguished guest, Jose W. Fernandez from the US government. Jose is the Undersecretary for Economic Growth, Energy and the Environment. Jose, great to have you here. We will have Jose for around 20 minutes before he has to head off, and then we'll move on to our panel discussion. We have 4 great panelists for you. I'll introduce them individually later. The subject of the panel is Achieving Sustainable Growth Through Connectivity. Now, Latin America, as we all know, was particularly hard hit by the pandemic. The region is home to around 8% of the world's population, and yet it suffered nearly 30% of all the deaths worldwide from COVID. The regional economy suffered too, contracted by around 7% in 2020. That's bigger than most areas of the world. So what have been the consequences of that impact from COVID? There are clearly many, but I'd like to highlight 3 very quickly. 1, an increase in poverty. The pandemic dumped an extra 5 million people into extreme poverty in Latin America. In 2020, 13.1% of Latin Americans were living in extreme poverty. By the end of the year, that figure had risen to 13.8%. Now, you might think, okay, well, this is within 1 percentage point, no big deal. But that's a setback of 27 years, according to the United Nations, in poverty reduction. Number 2, an increase in inequality. If you look at the Gini coefficient for Latin America, the standard measure of income distribution, it's been basically on a downward trajectory for the last 20 years. But over the last couple of years, we've seen a spike. For the first time since 2002, inequality has risen in the region. And number 3, I think this is a more debatable one, and it's one of the aspects I'd like to talk about today in our panel. The pandemic, I think, has forced governments around the region to change their priorities. When you have more poor people in your country, when you have more inequality, when you have rising food insecurity, then I think there's a danger that the issues that we're talking about today, digital transformation, digital inclusion, how to improve connectivity, there's a danger at least that those issues slip down the political agenda. And we all know that that would be a great shame, because these are very important issues for sustainable development in the region. I'm going to stop there and hand over to Mauricio Ramos, the CEO of Millicom, for 10 minutes of opening my remarks. Mauricio.
So since this is a very techy group, and Apple is announcing, or has already announced, its new operating system, I made my way to the Apple store just yesterday and bought the new iPad. All right? So my notes are all here digitally. How cool is that? Thank you, Gideon, for that, and thank you for the Financial Times or for the partnership to host these and make these happen. And thank you for all the governments that are participating and the host government. I want to focus my address today on how important it is for our region that this is happening and this continues to happen. This summit, this engagement, this relationship. What does it mean for, and I'm going to approach it from the way we view it, if you will, the money guys. And I'm going to say 2 things to just frame where all of it is coming from. Millicom Tigo is heavily invested in the region. We've invested $5 billion into M&A alone in Central America in the last 3 years. Just $5 billion into M&A just in the last 3 years. And we invest about $1 billion into the region every year, into digital networks, fiber into the ground, 4G networks. And just in the next 2 years, for the countries that make a part of the Partnership Fund in Central America, we've committed to $700 million, and delightfully so. The point is, and excuse my español, estamos más invertidos imposibles. We are vested. We are invested. This thing better work, right? Otherwise, I'll be out of a job, and I'll be the idiot who put this kind of money into this region. So we are both invested in the region, but that money, all of that money, is coming from here. And New York. Our investors are all New York-based, London-based, Stockholm-based, Europe-based. Latin America is seen, Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, all of these countries are seen through Millicom by international investors because they're so relevant to us. So we have a foot in Central America, in Latin America, and the other one in the international markets. And this is why this summit is so important to us. Now, additionally, I happen to be a dual citizen, Colombiano and American. I am one of those many immigrants. Actually, first generation. I came in to look for new opportunities. I am both now invested in the US and in Central America, both as an investor and as an individual, and this is a conversation I have with my kids. I do not want to have a divided heart. I do not want to have divided Americas. It doesn't help us as individuals. It doesn't help the region, and it certainly won't be good for business. So if you want to believe me, just follow the wallet. So this is why I think, from our point of view, the money that we've deployed in the region, we've done it because we think it has tremendous amount of potential. I'll tell you why. It is altogether 700 million people. It's just about half of China. If we only could get our act together, do more of these things, we would be humongous in terms of our presence. Our GDP combined is bigger than that of India. And here's the thing. We are extremely young, which means the digital adoption wave is in front of us, which is why I think investing all this money makes sense and why I think we need to get 3 things right. Probably have a few more minutes still to get the 3 things right. We need to deploy the infrastructure for development that is right for the future. Many of you have heard me say this, Silvia for sure. When I grew up in the streets of Colombia, I used to hike up to the mountains. And I would come down and I would get on the chivas, and there would be chickens and eggs and coffee coming down to the markets in unpaved roads. And then I worked for the Colombian government for a little bit, and we used to talk about building infrastructure for development. That infrastructure is phenomenal, necessary, ports and roads and airplanes. But what we need is for our students, for our labor force, to be able to export bits. That's the economy of the future. That is the democracy of the future. That is the economy of the future. And for that, they need what we call digital highways. As a matter of fact, our purpose as a company is to build digital highways. Those $700 million that are going into the partnership, they're all going into networks. The $1 billion that we invest on a yearly basis, it's all going into networks. Because I hold the utter belief that if we provide that digital infrastructure, and by the way, I was delighted when President Biden called it infrastructure. Digital infrastructure. He did that in his early days, because that is what it is. Infrastructure means it is used by everyone. That is what is called infrastructure. And it is very good to now be working with development banks and development institutions to make that infrastructure be the foundation. So that's number one, to build those digital highways. I go back to those days and those roads that remain unpaved, And I tell our team, all 24,000 employees all throughout Latin America, our job is to make sure that those digital highways do get built, even if some of our roads in Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, everywhere, remain unpaved. The second thing is to build digital inclusion. And you would think, why is a telecom guy talking about digital inclusion? And Visa and MasterCard know why, because we're partnering up with them. For years and years and years, we, the financial institutions, have been unable to bring in the Latinos, the Centroamericanos, into financial inclusion. Depending on what country you're in, 50 to 70% of that population remains unbanked. Unbanked meaning they're using cash. Most importantly, it means that when they're accessing credit, they're going to loan sharks. That ain't good. That is not the foundation for development. So over the last few years, we have begun to use our digital payment infrastructure, Tigo Money, because everybody has a phone. 99% of people have a phone, to make it available for individuals to pay. 5 million users, $5 billion in transactions in 5 countries in Latin America. Because I believe that we can leapfrog the payment ecosystem in Latin America, and in our markets, we can in a very short time frame, be paying digitally. Imagine what that means. It means that whereas the US is struggling to get Apple Pay or Google Pay to work, we will have figured it out with the partnerships we're putting in place with Visa and MasterCards and using phones as a way to pay. And then imagine the power of using those phones to disburse funds, relief funds like we did during the hurricane, or relief in Honduras, or relief funds like we did in Paraguay during the pandemic, directly to the phone, no cost of transaction. And imagine the ability to provide credit, microcredit, finally, to individuals, $10 credit, $5 credit, on your phone, delivered, at real rates. We're launching in Panama, end of this year. I know we have your commitment, as we have the many other countries. So that's number 2, digital inclusion. And number 3 is keeping the money bridges flowing. And I really use the word, yes, I can see some faces. What does he mean by the money bridges? Latin America, Central America, does not have the capacity to fund itself. We source every penny of investment from Stockholm, Boston, New York. If those guys get a return, we will come back with more investment. But the story, as we were talking, the story needs to be crisp to them. And it needs to go beyond the bad stuff. It needs to go on the good stuff as well. And it needs to have a lot more commercial trade, investment flowing into the regions. We will be there with you in the capital markets, telling the story of why Latin America really can work. And we need to come to terms with how integrated we have become. All of those tens of millions of immigrants, the ones that are already here, they are supporting our story. Esas remesas, those tens of billions of dollars, they are also an important, crucial part of the money bridge. So it's not only investment, it's not only trade, it is now remesas. We need to find ways to make those remesas work in a smoother way, less costly way. And that's, I think, the third area of priority, to find a way to make that money bridge continue to flow. Because as a businessman, I know there is no development, there is no job creation, there is nothing without investment, trade, and funding. And this, hopefully, is why we're so supportive of this and the hopefully many summits to come. Gracias.
Thank you, Mauricio. We'll move on to our interview with Jose Fernandez. But before we have the interview, I'd like to give the stage to Jose to make a few opening remarks, just a couple of minutes.
So I just asked my colleague from Panama to applaud as I was getting up. You didn't have to follow that. Mauricio, you see that I have my own iPad as well. So look, well, it's a delight to be here. Welcome to LA. We've got a number of colleagues that I've met over the years from Panama, from Guatemala. A number of you I see in the audience as well. It's a delight to be here, and welcome to LA, city that's home to many private sector leaders that are leaders in global digitalization. I could just riff on what Mauricio just said in terms of using the bridge, using the diaspora here, on remittances as well, which I think is an untapped resource for development. And I think the communications sector can be a real catalyst for that. But that's for another day. That's for another summit. I'm here to talk about digital transformation. And this summit's focus on digital transformation signals three important needs in the region. Need number one, the need to accelerate connectivity in the region to help bridge the digital divide, where Mauricio was just talking about the inequality in the digital use in the region. Second, the need to find investment to stimulate investment in secure critical infrastructure, be that virtual infrastructure or actually hard infrastructure, road or communications. And third, the need to promote an open, interoperable, and reliable internet. The challenge ahead of us is clear. You've heard it already, and you'll hear it again, I'm sure, in the summit. Inequality remains pervasive throughout our hemisphere. In fact, Latin America is the most unequal region in the world. The economic and social effects of COVID-19 have made these divisions even more acute, be it poverty, be it gender violence, be it a number of initiatives that have fallen by the wayside because of the pandemic. The good news is that in 2020, Latin America became the world's largest e-commerce market and fastest e-commerce market, with sales growth of 37%. A lot of that fueled by that demographic dividend that you're talking about. The bad news is that a third of our mobile technology is 3G. Over 50% of the technology is 4G. Only 1% is 5G. And that 70% of the population in the region is either unbanked or underbanked. So I think it's important that we speak at fora like this one and throughout the next few days on how we can harness our collective power to bridge the digital divide. And because this is the Summit of the Americas, and because at the Summit of the Americas we actually unveil a number of initiatives, I wanted to be here and just have a few minutes with you in order to announce that we're launching a new initiative at this summit. It's called the Digital Agenda for Transformation in the Americas. Digital Agenda for Transformation in the Americas, or the DATA Initiative in short. It's going to be our administration's signature program to bridge digital inclusivity to the region and to help make a commitment that a number of us in this room have to bridge the digital divide in Latin America. And we're going to try and do that in concert with other regional leaders in order to identify shared principles and develop a cross-cutting regional agenda for digital transformation, focusing on the three needs that I just outlined. How are we going to put this forward? In the near future, we are going to host in the next few months a digital economy ministerial. And during that ministerial, we're going to talk about a number of actionable paths towards digital inclusivity. This will include data privacy, a very important part of the build-out, digital infrastructure development, what Millicom has been trying to do in Central America and throughout the region for the last few years, 5G and network security, cyberspace norms, combating disinformation, and lastly, financial technology regulation, all of them critical in order to bridge that digital divide. In this initiative, we're going to work with the private sector. It'll be the private sector, civil society, and governments, all of us having a role to play. And together, if we're successful, we can advance a digital transformation that will deliver on the economic, social, and educational benefits of a sustainable ecosystem, an ecosystem that promotes inclusion, respects human rights, and guards against digital authoritarianism. So thank you again. Thank you again for hosting this. Thank you to the Financial Times. Good to see a number of colleagues from Guatemala, from Panama, and others. Thank you to the Financial Times. And I look forward to our conversation, Gideon, and I also look forward to working with many of you in this room as we move forward to make the data initiative a reality. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a great introduction to our topic today. Can I start by asking you about the final point I made in my introduction, that when if you're a Latin American government and you're dealing with increased food insecurity, you're dealing with increased poverty, increased inequality, how much time do you have left to deal with the issues of digital transformation, digital inclusion, however noble they may be? Do you feel as though there's been a shift of priorities in the region as a result of the pandemic?
This is the region, the Latin American region, the Caribbean region got hit the hardest, was the least prepared. We had public health systems that had not been funded for the most part. We had a number of disconnects between ministries of economy, ministries of health. We had a lot of work to do, and unfortunately, I think corruption played a part. In some countries in the region, about half of the ministries of health have been accused of graft. And so there's a lot of work to do. But I think, I do think that, going back to your question, and by the way, the reason I'm mentioning the health part is that we are going to be unveiling this afternoon an initiative with a number of countries in the region, including a number of you here, on health, on strengthening public health networks going forward, of cooperation, because we've got to prepare for the next pandemic. It's coming. We don't know what it'll be, but it'll happen. So, on the digital side, you cannot grow an economy for the reasons that Mauricio just mentioned, with the demographics, with the kinds of interconnections that we need. You can't create a remittances network that actually leverages remittances not just for consumption, but for growth, for infrastructure, without internet, without a digital infrastructure. So this is not charity. I think what's happening is some countries have done it better than others. There is interest. You just saw the auction in Brazil, where the 5G network, part of it was funded, and the winner paid over $8 billion. This is something that countries realize that they need to do, but there's some preparation to be done. There's a regulatory part of this that needs to take place. There's the type of investment climate that you need in order to attract investment. All of this is known. This is not charity, and I think governments, now that we are hopefully coming out of the pandemic tragedy, this is something they'll focus on, because there is a huge need for infrastructure, and that part of that need is on the digital side.
Okay. You have a very broad brief: climate change, renewable energy, the environment. I mean, I kind of feel as though your business card should say Undersecretary for Everything. Within that very broad portfolio, how important is telecoms?
How important is
telecoms and
it's critical. Look, there are studies out there that will tell you that a 10% increase in infrastructure spending in Latin America will grow GDP by 2 to 3%. That's one statistic that will tell you everything you need. But it's more than that. It's how are you going to bring the rural communities? Latin America is more and more urban, but there's still pockets of inequality, pockets of poverty in the region, in the countryside. That's going to require a better digital infrastructure, and I think, I think it's how do I make my salary? I find ways to cooperate with the private sector. I try to work with public institutions, with multilateral institutions to try and look for multipliers. Look for companies like a number of them that are here that will partner with the U.S. On these things. So I think digital infrastructure will not be done by governments anywhere in this region. We saw that in the 80s and 90s in the privatization wave. It'll require a lot of public investment. And so what I try and do when I talk about investment climate around the region, a lot of that is how do we bring the Millicoms of the world into the region and do it in a way that they will keep investing because they'll see opportunities. And again, that demographic dividend that Mauricio was just mentioning, won't last forever. Just ask the Chinese. They had a very young population, and they're getting older, as we all realize.
In my introduction, I focused on the negatives of the past couple of years, and they clearly have been very difficult years for many reasons. But if we take a longer view over the last 10 years or so, there have been advances in Latin America in terms of the digital space has been transformed, partly through to advances in technology, partly through to improved regulation. Can you kind of spell out for us, as you look around the region, what you think have been the achievements of the last 10 years, the positives?
So look, I'm old enough to have worked in about half of the telecom privatizations in Latin America, representing either bidders or governments in Bolivia, Peru. A number of them have been nationalized since, but I won't talk about that much. I think the penetration, the telecom penetration in the region is something we could not have imagined 20 years ago. It's hard to believe. But when we privatized the Peruvian phone company in almost 30 years ago, 25 years ago, penetration rates were under 10%. We had to provide in the concession agreement that you had to put one landline in towns in excess that had a population of 10,000 people. Think of that. In countries that now have a penetration rate that exceeds 1 per person. I think we've made great progress. The next step is going to be critical, though, of how do we harness the new technologies, how do we bring them in. 5G is coming. Not every country in the region is ready for it from a market perspective, but there are some that aren't. And I think we've got two challenges, at least that I see. One is countries in the region have to make sure that they attract the kinds of secure investments. We keep hearing about hacking in Costa Rica. Even today, there was a hacking at one of the ministries. We've got to make sure that we do this securely, because there is a vulnerability with some providers. That's one challenge. The other challenge we have, and it's related to the first. From a U.S. point of view, we don't have full stack telecom providers or digital infrastructure providers. We've lost those companies. Now the Europeans and obviously the PRC, the Chinese have a stake. We've got to find, from a U.S. point of view, a way to incentivize our companies to get involved. And one way of doing that we're working on is radio access networks, Open RAN. It's cheaper. It brings you're not depending on one provider. It brings interoperability. It brings competition, and it'll make it cheaper for companies to invest in the region. So, what are we trying to do in my little bailiwick at the State Department? Working on regulatory support, and we have dozens of people that spend time in the region talking about regulatory development. And secondly, we've got to find alternatives in the region through Open RAN in order to find ways to make it cheaper and more accessible for countries. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that answers your question.
Mm-hmm. You gave some interesting stats in your introduction. Only 1% of Latin America is running on 5G at the moment. Yeah. The other 99% on 3G and 4G. And 70% of the region is either unbanked or underbanked.
That's right.
How do we get that first figure up and the second figure down?
Well, I mean, you got to ask the Millicoms of the world, when does it become financially viable. The fact of the matter is, right now, in many countries, it's probably not a terribly great economic idea. But I think in the next 5 years, with the Internet of Things, with the kinds of new developments that you're seeing in the cyber world, I think they will be. And I think the challenge will be to take the leap sooner rather than later. So I do think it's coming. I think Brazil is looking at it. They had a very successful auction. You don't pay the kind of money that was paid in Brazil if you're just going to sit on the license.
Mm-hmm. We've been talking mostly about access and affordability, but you touched on the issue of security as well. As Latin American nations roll out their 5G technology, what do they need to do, particularly at the planning stage, to safeguard privacy, security, and ensure trustworthiness?
Well, look, we have, it's no secret that we have talked about how companies like Huawei, in our view, are not secure. And we don't say it glibly. That's a statement that's made on a lot of information that I've seen, and that some of it we can't share. The fact of the matter is, by law, by Chinese law, companies such as Huawei have to follow the dictates of the government. That's in the legislation in China. That presents a vulnerability. What's been the problem? We've got to provide alternatives in the region. It's hard to say to somebody, don't use Huawei when it's the cheapest, if you've got nothing else to offer. And so you've got a number of European companies that we've become in many ways some of their best advocates for Ericsson, for Nokia, even though they're not U.S. companies. But I think from a U.S. point of view, we've got some promising technologies here. The Japanese do as well. The Koreans do as well. You will see a lot more emphasis on our part on secure networks and on Open RAN. We think actually that's a wave of the future, not just for security reasons, but also for price reasons as well.
Jose, I know you have a very busy schedule, so I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. Very interesting insights.
Thank you.
As I say, we have four very interesting panelists from different parts of the sector. Let me introduce them. We have Dorothy, in no particular order. Dorothy Atwood from the Walt Disney Company.
With an A, but no particular order.
Dorothy is a Senior Vice President for Global Public Policy at Disney. Robert Taliercio from the World Bank. Robert is the Regional Director for Equitable Growth, Finance and Institutions for Latin America and the Caribbean. From Panama, we have Ramon Martinez de la Guardia, an advisor to the President of Panama and a former Minister of Trade and Industry. And next to me here, Janio Rosales, the Economy Minister of Guatemala. So thank you all for coming. We have a great mix of North America, Central America, private sector, World Bank, and governments. Rob, if I can start with you, and if I can ask you the same question that I asked Jose a few minutes ago, given the challenges that the pandemic threw up, has digital transformation become less of a priority for governments around the region? Has it slipped down the political agenda, do you think?
Well, I think, I agree with the Undersecretary's point that there are many challenges at the moment. He was mentioning also that by some measures, Latin America is the most unequal region in the world. It's also now, by some measures, the most indebted region in the world. It's also now, for this year and next year, barring Eastern Europe, the region with the lowest growth. So it's got serious problems at the moment. I do think that what the pandemic showed, however, was that the countries that were ready on both the public sector sides and the private sector sides with digital infrastructure, policies, applications, and so on, benefited enormously. So we saw a massive take-up in digital financial services for the first time in many countries because of the pandemic. So the incentives were there, obviously very strong incentives, and you can't replicate those going forward necessarily, but the incentives were there for significant use of digital financial services in many countries across the region. Some of them, like Mexico, where you had close to 30% of consumers making digital financial payments for the first time in 2020. Similarly, on the public sector side, you saw the same thing. So Argentina, for example, where we had helped the government set up a Mi Argentina portal, that was a single portal for government services. You saw the usage spike from 1.5 million users to 5 million users during 2020. So I think the lesson is there. The governments that were ready, the private sector that was ready, took advantage of it, and so that lesson I think will carry this agenda forward. For example, at the World Bank now, we have received many more requests from governments in the region for support on digital government operations because they saw what happened. And so the whole concept of being more resilient, whether it's to pandemics, natural disasters, climate change, I think is still front and center in the minds of the leaders of the region. And we're seeing also from the leaders down to the technical level, this is an area where they want more support and they want to further develop out. Same with financial sector. We can come to that perhaps later. But so I think the impetus and the momentum is still there.
Okay, and generally speaking, if you look across the region, how well do you think Latin American governments and the telecoms companies that operate in Latin America are doing in ensuring that people in the region do have good access to good digital broadband services at an affordable prices?
Well, I do think this is the problem. We started to talk a bit about it, but some statistics on this. 10% of the population in Latin America and the Caribbean is still not covered by 3G or 4G. And even where coverage is available, the adoption is still low. So less than, for example, 40% of the population subscribes to 4G services. Less than 50% of households subscribe to fixed broadband services. So even where it's available, the usage is lower. And then there's the rural-urban connectivity gap, which is also very concerning. So 40% versus 70%. So massive gap there. There's also a gender bias as well. We can come to that later. But for example, digital financial services are used by women 9 percentage points lower than by men. So lots of gaps there that still need to be addressed. Affordability is still a problem as well. 60% of those without any form of internet connection cite the high cost as a main obstacle. So I think that's something we need to work on. Also, quality of service is low, particularly in rural areas. There's a statistic, I cover the whole region, Latin America and Caribbean, so I like to compare it to other regions of the world. And East Asia and Pacific is a peer region of Latin America as an upper middle income country region. And there you saw, whereas Latin America and East Asia were roughly in the same position in the year 2000 in terms of fixed broadband subscriptions per 100 citizens. East Asia is now up at 26%, and Latin America is only at 15%. So again, very unfortunate the region has not been able to keep pace with the demand, but also with other regions that have been able to do much better than. So Latin America could do this. I think it's a problem. Most of the countries do not have e-government capability that is as good as, say, Argentina or Uruguay. Again, there's a lot of interest, but quite a few limitations in terms of still what's available. Mm-hmm. There are some siloed approaches. Some ministries run systems. They don't talk to each other. Cybersecurity is not there. We're supporting the government of Costa Rica with a project called Hacienda Digital that is trying to address these issues, but again, a little bit late. On the other hand, they are taking those steps. So, but I think these issues are critical in terms of cost and accessibility and also quality of services.
Okay. If I can turn to our participants from Central America now, for the two of you, can you give us an idea of what the telecom sectors look like in your respective countries? Who are the big players? How good is internet access? How much has it improved? Have broadband prices come down? Have telecom services improved in your two countries? And looking ahead, what do you think the big challenges are? What are the new regulations that needed in the two sectors? Jenny, if I could maybe start from you. Tell us about Guatemala.
Okay. First of all, thank you to Financial Times and Millicom for doing this great event. For us, it's a true honor to be here, and on behalf of the President, he sends his best regards. I think that what Mauricio just mentioned, and also Jose, puts us in the right perspective of the challenges that we are lacking in Latin America. But for instance, in Guatemala, we see these challenges as opportunities. In the last year, regarding the pandemic, we had the best economic performance of our economy grew 8%. This is the best performance in these 40 years. We only lost 1.5% of the growth in the GDP growth, and this puts us in the perspective that we are the most resilient economy in the region. We have a digitalization plan within the Guatemala General Policy Plan 2020-2024, and we are working to accelerate all the institutional framework. For instance, we just approved anti-red tape bill that it has puts us where you were mentioning in the e-government agenda, and we are working also in different one-stop shops. For instance, we have now launched the investment one-stop shop, the construction one-stop shop, and also as Minister of Economy, we are leading all the agenda to put us in the right framework to have this framework that is needed. And we also know that we have big gaps and challenges regarding connectivity in rural areas, but the president is really committed in this leadership. And you also mentioned the key players that are in Guatemala. We have Millicom. We have to mention that we are really grateful for the investment that they made in 2021. It's the biggest investment of any company in Guatemala, and this has also led us to new big investments. For instance, we have Yasaki, an American and Japanese enterprise that is already mentioned 160 million for the next years, and we think we are in the right perspective for the next 5 or 10 years. So we need to keep on going and working to reduce the gap of connectivity in rural areas, and also to promote more inclusive connectivity. And we think that we have the institutional framework and also the leadership of our president that is really committed to do this. So,
Great, thank you, Jayo. And Ramon, tell us about the situation.
Good morning, and
in
thank
Panama.
you for the invitation to Millicom, Mauricio, Financial Times. In Panama, we really had a great experience in regards of the digital services that the private companies provide, and also we have an authority of innovation that really helped us in one key plan that we had to implement when we had to lock down, as all countries did, the commercial activities. We put in place a plan called Panamá Solidario, and it was responsible for giving financial aid to those persons that had to had their labor contracts suspended. And we had the innovation of having our ID card as a medium of payment. So everyone got the amount of dollars that we were able to bring to all of them in their ID card. So they go to the supermarkets and buy their goods. As we see Panama as the financial and digital hub, we have very, very good partners in this sector, like Millicom. We're working together. I think it's essential that the public sector and the private sector continues to work together. We have a plan for having internet para todos, se llama 100% internet for all citizens and residents of Panama, including the rural areas. And that's coming along very well. I hope that this administration of President Cortizo can finalize that. It is so important because at the end, that's a key part in reducing the inequality gap, having people connected. So I think we're moving in the good direction. We also have a plan of education. We need to educate our labor force and to be able to get into the digital agenda. And we're putting together also a plan for all government institutions to communicate, to coordinate in the same digital and technological platform. So I think that will help with reducing times for all tramits, all processes, reducing the discretion for officials. Everything simplified and digitalized will definitely help also in the private sector for attracting more investment.
Okay. Dorothy, you're coming at this from a slightly different perspective from the private sector at Disney. Obviously, now you have a world-class streaming service. It's a company that's a wonderful provider of entertainment for customers around the world, including in Latin America. People tuning into this panel might wonder what the connection is between Disney and sustainable economic growth. Can you make that connection for us? What is Disney and other companies like Disney? What are you doing to close that digital gap in Latin America?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for inviting me, and welcome to Hollywood. We haven't talked about the ambient content community that you've all joined, but this is the Walt Disney Company's headquarters, and so we welcome you to enjoy the city while you're here. There was a lot of talk this morning about three things that are important in developing bridging the digital divide, and also in developing advancing the economic future. And I have three things too. My three are, two of them are the same. The first is connectivity, which for a content company is essential. We need rich broadband. We need broadband at speeds that can support services that get to consumers. We need the network effect, where the investments, the billions of dollars that are being invested in the infrastructure, reach the farthest corners of the world. And that's really good for companies like mine. And you guys have a good way to talk about that, so I'll leave that as a separate pillar that's been advanced. The second is, I think of it as a trust network. There was a lot of talk about security and the need to make sure that, in fact, the infrastructure is protected. I look at it from a consumer perspective. Consumers really won't use the infrastructure if they think that they're going to be harmed by it. That includes banking, the unbanked issue. I'm very bullish on mobile banking around the world. It also enables the infrastructure that buys our products. So e-commerce drives investment, drives more activity. But consumers have to believe that, in fact, that infrastructure is safe for them to use. And so it's an area where we have to, as a business community, we have to work very much with our partners, the telecom partners, all the infrastructure providers, to make sure that, in fact, we can make the promise that this is secure. And then also as businesses that use that infrastructure. So, it's not a secret that Disney is pretty bullish on its intellectual property protection. We protect the mouse and its image. But honestly, for a company like Disney, it's not we have remedies. But for the small creator, for the individual who has a story to tell, that individual, if they put that, or the fashion designer from an indigenous community, they put that mark out on the internet, and that's appropriated by anybody on the net without any kind of protection, that also really actually can depress the use of the platform and the infrastructure for commerce. The third area, though, which nobody talked about today, and I understand it, but the third area which drives is adoption. And adoption is driven, honestly, not by the health or the government services available. That is incredibly important, and but someone doesn't want to pay money for broadband services to get better government services as a general rule. They actually want to pay money for things they want to see, which is content. So you're going to be very compelling as a business proposition for a broadband provider if that person who is our customer is able to watch their favorite football match during the day on their phone. That takes investment in infrastructure, but that also takes bringing to them compelling content. And that compelling content is where I believe we have an incredibly important partnership with our telecom partners. I'll also say that there are two other things about content. One is the innovation and distribution. That drives the ICT industry entirely. It means people buy higher grade phones so they can see the rich media on those phones. It means that they buy higher plans in order to have the service. It means that actually there's innovation in the way in which we deliver it to meet the divide in income. So are there ways to provide very innovative services that allow people to see only the things they want to see and pay only for the things they want to pay? And that's happening in Latin America as we speak. And then finally, there's also our industry is one of the most accessible industries for youth employment. So you don't need a degree in engineering in order to tell a story. You need a smartphone and you need an idea. And then that idea can actually become something very meaningful and actually a long-term source of employment for youth. It's also cool. So we find that actually some of our best creators are the young people around the world who are fearless about telling their stories. And so that's a real benefit from that content brings is encouraging the capacity for the youth really to be part of the creative economy, which includes not only storytelling, not only directing, not only behind the camera, or in front of the camera, but behind the camera. It means people who are holding the equipment for the lights. It means the people who are setting up the stages. Those are not, they are good jobs. They are not required, aren't required to have a college diploma. And that means that entry and that ability to actually provide an employment vehicle and economic development is there.
Okay. You mentioned the importance of compelling content. What about locally relevant
so
content?
locally,
Because clearly what works in one country might not work in another. Can you give us a few examples
Sure. Well,
from Latin America?
Latin America, we're quite bullish on Latin America in terms of developing content. I have to say there are a number of different kinds of locally compelling content. There are universal stories that are told from the lens of Latin America. That's Coco, Encanto. We had even our early Pixar movie Up is actually uses Venezuela as the background for that. Those are major multi-million-dollar productions that actually are able to amplify a story from Latin America to the world. But they're also actually locally produced content. We announced in our last earnings report that we have 200 original productions in Latin America in the pipeline. That's a lot when you consider the cost of content, but it also means there are 200 separate productions that are employing locals to create that content, that are in fact providing the additional benefit of if there are movie stars coming down, they're creating restaurants and activity in that town in order to build that production. Those productions really drive a ton of employment, and more importantly, if they're good, which is what many of them are, they become a vehicle for a larger audience, the diaspora all over the world. Because a platform like Disney Plus is, in fact, we use the local language, we use Spanish all over. And also there have been tremendous success like Violeta, and there is Soluna. These are shows that started in Latin America and are all over the world now. And so we really find the investment, because Latin America is a series of storytelling communities, that. So being able to find that content is actually great for our business.
Okay. Rob, I wanted to ask you about e-government. we all, whether we want to or not, whether we like to or not, we have to engage with our governments, with our states, whether it's to pay taxes or apply for a passport, whatever it is. How well are Latin American governments doing in providing their citizens with the kind of platforms they need to engage and to carry on their daily lives as easily as possible?
Yeah, well, I think there's a wide variation across the region on this. As I mentioned, the governments that had already started on it, were in great shape then when the pandemic hit to really expand. But even others that hadn't done, let's say, quite as much took advantage of it. So, for example, Guatemala, my colleague was mentioning, they increased the use of social payments, social welfare payments during the pandemic, and did it through digital means. So digital financial payments, which they hadn't really done before. So took advantage of that opportunity. Other examples from other countries as well. I mentioned the Argentina case, and they also used the system that they had set up there in Argentina for the mobile passes during the pandemic. Those who were able to get out and move around, they were able to use that government system that the World Bank had supported them in developing to actually issue that and kind of manage the pandemic. So I think that lesson is there. The other thing that I thought was quite interesting that we're seeing so far is that I think this agenda actually spans the political divide. So, for example, in Argentina, this work I mentioned, we started with the Macri administration. It has been continued and deepened by the Fernandez administration. So you don't see, a new government coming in from a different side of the political spectrum and saying, stop this, we don't agree with this anymore. So I think that also bodes well for the region. We have a framework that we like to use to try to think about this, which has sort of three levels: the foundational level, the core government systems, and then the services to citizens. So at the foundational level, my colleague from Panama was mentioning this point about interoperability of government systems, the point about cybersecurity, the point about digital records management, all that back office stuff that's not very exciting, but digital ID. Digital ID is critical to making this work. You mentioned that as well. Some countries, like Mexico, where we're working with the Mexican government on getting a digital ID, a biometric digital ID. Currently in Mexico, there are something like 60 forms of ID that are used, mostly paper-based or different systems that don't talk to one another. So that's a priority there. Then there's the core government systems, which is sort of revenue and expenditure and e-procurement and things like that. Very important, boring, but very important, not as exciting as Mickey Mouse. But, you can save percentage points of GDP by using an e-procurement system as opposed to doing it, manually. We've seen that, and we take those examples. Panama was a good example of that as well. And we show them, this is how you want to save 1 or 2 percentage points of your gross domestic product. Let's look at making procurement more competitive, transparent, reduce the discretion through an e-procurement system. Then there's the top level, which is the citizen services. So this is everything from your driver's licenses to your passports, birth certificates, having a single government portal there, I think, is very important. This is the case we saw in Argentina. In Uruguay, that's one of the more advanced digital countries in the region, and they're doing a phenomenal amount on this agenda. They're putting up, for example, research online. They're putting up textbooks, university materials, so that students can just go online and get all this for free. They don't have to pay. Those textbooks can be very expensive, for example. The Plan Ceibal, which had linked up all elementary schools in the country to a digital system before the pandemic. So again, in great shape. But others are lagging, to be honest. But I think the experience of the pandemic has let them understand. Similar to the Caribbean. So we had requests for support on this e-government agenda in the Caribbean well before the pandemic. Why? Because when the hurricane hit and wiped out your building and your records were destroyed, and even your computers were destroyed if they were on the ground floor and so on. So they came and said, we need to digitize this, we need to put it in the cloud, we need to have government systems running so that when the next hurricane hits, we don't shut down. So this kind of, I think, the shocks, unfortunately, that the region has been seeing, whether it's natural disasters, even climate change, or the pandemic, has certainly, I think, built the momentum for this now. And we're seeing it. We're doing a lot more. I know the IDB is doing a lot more To me, this is an agenda that spans the political spectrum in terms of e-government, and the use case has been established, and so the demand is really picking up.
Gianni and Ramon, I'd like to talk a little bit about nearshoring. There's been a lot of talk about nearshoring over the last couple of years. People are increasingly questioning why US companies are sourcing components in the Far East when they could be sourcing them much closer to home in places like Guatemala and Panama. And some of the supply chain issues which we've seen over recent years could maybe be avoided. So what are your two countries doing in the area of nearshoring, particularly in the communications sectors? Gianni, if we start with you.
So first of all, we have been working in a strategic public-private country strategy called Guatemala Moving Forward. It was launched in 2021, and this is the guideline or the main route that provides us with two key areas. First of all, to build trust with the private sector. Actually, we have two key representatives of the private sector from Guatemala. And the key is that we know the limitations of public policies, but working with the private sector, we get to know what are the needs, not only to build up all this legal investment framework, but also to see around the world what are the perspectives and also the opportunities. And now we are working in a draft bill for nearshoring that we think with all the challenges that are happening internationally, especially in China, now we have the opportunity for these enterprises from the United States to allocate in Central America, especially in Guatemala. Now we think that we have one of the most competitive legal frameworks in Central America, and being the most important economy in the region, and also with the strategic macroeconomic stability, not only, as I was mentioning, the 8% growing of our economy, also the rate of our monetary sectors, and also the big information and good news that we have been having. For instance, IMF for the second year put us in a great view internationally for investment, and also the key players like, for instance, Millicom and America Mobile, etc., now are seeing Guatemala as the best place for investment. So we think that we have to keep on going and working with the different sectors, and also to moving around all over the world. And for instance, in our ministry, we have been attending more than 25 investment opportunity from more than 20 countries. And last year we have an 3.4 billion of direct investments in Guatemala, and now we have a perspective for 2 billion. So we think that we have to keep on going with this, and with the leadership of the president, the government, and also all the public sector, we think that we are going to achieve this success.
Great. And Ramon, nearshoring in Panama?
Well, start by saying that we have an unprecedented geographical position that has allowed us to be considered one of the key link in supply chain, not only because of the Panama Canal, but also we have 5 of the most important ports in Latin America. Actually, the 2 most active, one on the Atlantic and one on the Pacific, allow us to have the possibility to give companies access to the different markets, whether it is Latin America or the Caribbean. But we have not only that, during the pandemic, we were 24/7 open and giving access and helping development, the maritime trade in the world. And that reliability, and I'll say that that's a key word, reliability in supply chain is everything. It made Panama one of the 6 humanitarian hubs during the pandemic, and we continue to do that. And I'm sure that later in this summit, we're going to be talking about public health, how countries are going to be preparing for that. Panama is definitely one key component on that area. So the airports, the railroads, the ports, the Panama Canal, it's in essence, we are ready to to help companies in these nearshoring strategies. But in addition to that, we also created a law that we call EMA, which is for manufacturing services for multinational companies. That regime is integral in the sense that you have tax benefits, you have immigration, work visas, permits that are very easy to obtain in a one-stop shop office that allow for companies and their foreign executives to move easily to Panama. Panama is a cosmopolitan city with great infrastructure, and the schools are very good. It is a safe country, and that has allowed Panama to be the house of 180 multinational companies that serve the region from Panama. The connectivity, we connect to 90 cities around the world. Very easy to get to Panama with direct flights to the most important cities in North and South America. So all of that is helping us to position ourselves as the leading country in receiving companies for establishing production processes, whether it is full manufacturing or light manufacturing, maybe labeling, packaging, but distribution centers are also coming along in Panama. So we have also been having strategic relationship with the Department of State. We know that it's very important in the Biden administration to make sure that companies put part of the production in, whether in the United States or in countries that are friends of the United States. The digital part, the telecommunications part is very important for these companies also, and I forgot to mention when I was talking about the digital hub of Panama that crossing the Panama Canal, so in Panama we have 8 of the most important fiber optic submarine cables that position ourselves as a country that has the greatest connectivity, but not only by air or by sea, which we are very much recognized, but also in the digital arena and telecommunications. We are fortunate to also be blessed with not having natural disasters, no earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, nothing like that. And that also helps companies to establish data centers, contact centers, and all those type of centers that require a stable country.
Yeah.
And speaking of that, we also are very socially, legally, and politically stable. We have been the #1 growing country in financial and economic growth during the past 15 to 20 years. And that is because not only all of what I'm saying, but also, and this is something that we need to also include other of our neighbor countries, social stability is crucial.
Right.
And legal stability, because if you are going to make an investment as important as establishing a production plant, you need to be sure that that company is going to safeguard the conditions by which you enter. Mm-hmm. Stability is very important.
Okay, so I can see that both of your countries are very well positioned for nearshoring, and you have many of the attributes that you need. Is it actually happening, or is it at the moment an aspiration?
Yep.
Well, in Guatemala, it's actually happening. For instance, like I was mentioning, we have attended more than 20 or 25 different countries with 20 to 25 enterprises. We have been conducting different investment summits. For instance, we just recently have one from textiles, and all the different enterprises, some of them from the United States, want to allocate their operations now from different countries for Central America to Guatemala. Also, we have an investment legal framework. For instance, only this year we have launched the foreign investment law, free exchange of currency law, a new commerce code, free zones law, and public special economic development zones, new investment one-stop shop. Like I was mentioning, the private sector working with us with this Guatemala moving forward. So we think that, and also we have access to the biggest economy, United States, and also Mexico. We have the great location geographical, and also we have a big economic, a big demographic bonus. We have from 24 to 35, almost 70% of our people. And also we have been working on a strategic plan of our minister in a new road for entrepreneurs, because we think that you also, when you talk about connectivity, you also have to think about these entrepreneurs that need that digitalization. So we already launched a new plan with them, and we are putting in the internet all the products from them. And so what we need also to work is within Central America is to work in a more integrated economy. We were working with the Minister of El Salvador and also with the different countries, because to be more attractive as a region, we need to have the institutional framework, because at the end, all the commerce and the products need to pass through all our countries, and we need to build up prosperity walls, so we are not anymore a problem for migration, especially in the United States. And for instance, in Guatemala, we have more than 200 companies from the United States, so we need to keep on working together, and we think, and we see with great eyes this new plan that Jose was mentioning, the digitalization plan for the region. So we are eager to work with them, and also, as I was mentioning, to have an institutional framework in the long term, because some of the lacks that we have in public policy, it's regarding that our governments are 4 years, and we cannot think in 4 years and the next 4 years and the next 4 years. We need to have this framework. So this Guatemala moving forward has a view of 15 years, and we are thinking that we are going to generate 1.5 new jobs in Guatemala. And also we are working in a new scholarships program. So our human capital has the capacities, especially in English. So all the companies that want to go to Guatemala, for every country now, they have the human resources.
Okay, great. Ramon?
Yes.
Nearshoring, is it happening, or is it an aspiration?
It's both, because we have examples of companies like 3M that are manufacturing their products and selling it, taking advantage of our geographic position and selling to their Latin American clients. We have examples with pharmaceuticals that are also producing their meds in Panama and distributing. But the aspiration is that moving processing plants from Asia to Latin America takes time.
Yeah.
So we have the aspiration that what we have seen geopolitically, but in supply chain disruptions, we had the Bloomberg New Economy Gateway in Panama a couple of weeks ago, and everyone was talking about trying to move part of the production to countries like Panama and Central America. I agree with Janio that we need to work together more in the sense that if we integrate Central America, it's very powerful what we can offer. So it is happening, but we have great aspirations that this can be a big opportunity for our countries and for our people, giving them opportunities that allow our societies to be more equal.
Mm-hmm. Dorothy, a question for you. What more can governments in the Americas do, North and South? What more can they do to help local creative companies, the potential Latin American Disneys of the future? What kind of policy framework needs to be put in place?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are a couple of things that you would expect, I would say. One is policies that incent rather than require. So, there is a lot of, around the world, we face a variety of public policies that require content creators to use local talent in making that content. There are quotas of various sorts. Europe has a whole host of them, and they seem superficially attractive, except that, in fact, what they do is they really retard the innovation. because you're prescribing exactly how much investment you need to do and who you need to hire, rather than organically seeing what's happening today, for example, in Latin America, where we are partnering with local production companies because it's the right thing for our product. We launched Disney Plus streaming services in all of Latin America in 2020, and then added to that the Star General Entertainment product, and we launched that in 2021. And in that context, the amount of investment that has gone in to attract customers, which is going to happen because I'm going to want to find locally relevant content that drives people to buy the service, to look at the value proposition, and to work with those local producers to give us an understanding about what in fact is compelling content for the region. And it's always really different. My job allows me to be a little bit, see kind of different trends in the world. And content creation is one of those that really mirrors culturally the local aesthetic, the local sensibilities. And it always struck me that we would take a show like Desperate Housewives and we would reversion it all over the world, sell that product to different we'd license that product. In reversioning it, we did several things. One, we would hire local actors to be the voiceovers because the actual, the dialect was really important. So it wasn't just gonna be good enough to have a Spanish a language version. It needed to be Spanish as spoken in Argentina, which is quite different, as you know, than Spanish as spoken in Spain. Similarly, so we would hire also recognizable voices. But what was funny is that same actual content reversioned. When it was reversioned in the UK, the show didn't do very well, and it didn't do very well because there were too many episodes. The UK audience is used to their 4 and 6 episode series, which are a lot happens in each episode. Well, the US is quite used to we have to create a lot of episodes because they were on television, and so it was feeding the machine. And so each season had over 25 episodes, which is a lot more than 4 to 6. And so, but when it went to Latin America, what we found was actually, what the complaint was, there weren't enough episodes because the audience wanted more like a telenovela. They wanted more of a soap opera going through, and so we had to add. We had to add a bunch of episodes to that, and so but that happens because we're driven by the consumer desire. We're not driven by what a government or regulatory structure says is required. And I'd always encourage government policy to look and say, is there something that is not being met through the incentives of that company? And right now, I would tell you that companies like Disney are really bullish on the region. We have an office in Panama. We have 7 offices around. We have a wonderful tour in Guatemala called Adventures by Disney in Guatemala. So all of these partnerships happen because they're good business for us and because, in fact, the market is poised to become incredibly important. I'd also tell you that the local producers generally see it that way when there's partnerships. So our business model is we actually work with the local producers. We work in the local production, local houses. We don't build our own studios. We use the studios and the locations. So we're really very much part of the local fabric, which is, again, the intent of some of these kinds of regulations. And so, I would look and say, always look to see, can you incent, can you work? And then there are actual subsidies that at play, and those operate in Brazil, they operate in Argentina. They were just launched in Colombia. That increases the incentive for global productions, not so much the local productions, but global productions, to consider working in those regions. But right now, I think Latin America is one of the best places to do business from a content perspective because of the investment that's going on at the broadband level. That's very exciting. That means that we're poised to see a lot more customers because a lot more customers will be able to afford and come online and be able to get a rich media experience. And we're seeing real government policies that support the idea of let the market operate, and so it's a right now we find it a great place to do business.
Mm-hmm. Rob, what do you see as the regulatory challenges facing the communications industry in Latin America over the coming years?
I mean, I think the main one is competition. I think we need more competition in Latin America across just about every sector, but certainly in the digital sector. This is an area where there isn't a political consensus around it because there are vested interests. So we've had some cases in countries in the region where there was very strong opposition, from the existing banks, for example, to bringing in fintechs. I know Tigo suffered some of this in some of the countries in the region. So there we try to provide the technical assistance, the economic analysis to show why this is beneficial to society in terms of economic growth and productivity. But I do think that's a major agenda for the region. The whole fintech agenda is critical as well. So Mexico was a leader in fintech with the first fintech law in the region. We supported them on that. But what became apparent after the law was enacted, of course, then COVID hit as well. But the regulatory support wasn't there. So the issuing key regulations had to come in. And before that was done, there wasn't too much movement on the fintech actually take up by companies. Now there's quite a lot. So now we see there are quite a few. For example, there have been over 50 applications for fintech licenses now in Mexico, with 14 having received full authorization and 38 conditional authorization. So that happened only after regulations on cybersecurity and consumer protection for electronic payments were put in place. So that's a good lesson, a good experience from the Mexico case, which we can now use in other countries around the region. I think Chile now, there's a fintech law before the Congress, so they're also looking at learning from the Mexican experience on what works and what hasn't. But I think that to my mind is an area where the Undersecretary was talking about the fact that almost half of adults in LAC are unbanked, and then if you look at from the digital financial payments side, only about a third, I think 35% of adults have used actual digital financial services. So this is another vast area, vast market. We have to get out there. We talked about the constraints in terms of connectivity, cost, and so on. But we just think this is absolutely vital for the future of the region. So there is a whole legal and regulatory side of it as well.
Yeah, that was a startling statistic from Jose Fernandez that 70% of Latin Americans are either unbanked or underbanked. Yeah. So a question for all of you, your own experiences from Guatemala and from Panama. What can we do about that? How can we get that figure down?
Well, I think that we have great ideas for hearing what we, for instance, like Marisa was saying, and a great idea that they are going to work, for instance, with the government of Panama. So we are eager to work within this type of framework. And in Guatemala, we have a very stable financial sector, and we think that is really open. And we are also working in giving the people in Guatemala the opportunity to have access to credits, but in good rates. For instance, we just passed a new law that is a housing law, social housing law, that is going to allow people from 1.4 wages to access to the most important thing that a family can own is to have a home. So we think that within this type of framework, we are allowing not only to have a society of property, but also to inhibit people to migrate to the United States. And we have to keep on going, for instance, in all the tech issues, to have opportunity to have more inclusive and financial opportunity for people. We also have to work on education regarding finances, because one of the key issues that, for instance, we have regarding credit cards, people have credit cards, but they don't have education. So then afterward, you're going to see people with legal problems and different situations. So it's a more integrated and or wider view of the specific aspect of financiation for people. But as a government, we are trying to move the agenda and also to work with the private sector once again to have the trust and to see that we have different gaps and also different realities, because it's not the same type of financiation or credit for people in rural areas than people in central areas. So we think that we have to move on working with that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And Ramon, and what does the fintech arena look like in Panama, and what more can be done to get more people banked?
I agree with Robert in the sense that it's probably something of the traditional banks and their economic interest. This is something that they need to accept the change into fintech. We have a law that is in the National Assembly in Panama after the 3 debates that are necessary to make it a law, and now it's in the office of the president for the sanction. Many concerns, of course. We for us is super crucial and important, AML. So we're gonna be very focused on that. But again, private companies should step up to the plate and invest. We as a government will help this happening. Millicom has a great vehicle, which is Tigo Money. Mm-hmm. In Panama, we have 52% of the population that is not bankerized formally. That's the only way that you can really get to it, is by using the technology, using fintech. So we are very close to having a fintech regulation. And I think we have the support of the private companies to move forward, and we also need traditional banks to get into the train. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
Can I just comment on that too, just
Sure.
from a person in the commerce area or a company in the commerce area, because it's keypad literacy. So one of the reasons that Asia has in fact adopted so much is that people are using the payments on the phones, and they are in fact because they don't have to again have a tremendous amount of education. But they know how to use the keypad. And so you look at places like India, you look at places in developing economies in Malaysia, Thailand. They are far exceeding the U.S. developed countries in their ability to have commerce on their phone and services. It's not just banking. It's ordering food. There's a whole, and that's an understatement. I mean, there's a whole ecosystem that's created because of keypad literacy. And so I absolutely support, from a government policy, work and investment in mobile technology to build a banking infrastructure, because the barrier for consumers to entry is low, and that will mean adoption, which will drive all the virtuous cycle of the other public services and other things that can be used from the digital infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I get the impression that a lot of this has been driven to some extent by the pandemic, right? Yeah. I mean, where I am in Colombia, there's far more interest in fintech than there was maybe 2 or 3 years ago, because people are thinking, okay, in times of pandemic, you don't want to be using a traditional bank. Yeah. You want to be using fintech. The other statistic which jumped out at me from Jose's presentation was that stat that still most of the region is using 3G and 4G and not yet 5G. 1%, he said. Can you tell us a little bit about the situation in your countries? What kind of penetration rates you have for 5G in Panama and Guatemala, and what more can be done to get that statistic up?
We are working now with big players in Guatemala with the 4G. We think that we have to consolidate the 4G, and we have to start thinking about 5G, because 5G is not going to be for access for everyone, because it's expensive. So we need to move on in this consolidation, and also to have the needs of the private sector and the needs of the framework and the needs of all the people of Guatemala. So what we are working now as a government is in consolidating the 4G platform, and we think that we're moving forward, and we think that we're going to have great results in 2022 and 2023.
Ramon?
Yeah.
I think Panama is really close to having the infrastructure. The spectrum is very important. That is something that we are doing a good job in making public bids for the companies to get the necessary spectrum to deploy the 5G. So right now we have 4G mostly, but yeah, I think it's a matter of time. Having the right technology, it's important. We don't want to rush into anything, and we are very careful with safety, network, and clean network. Yes.
Okay. And Rob, I'll give you the crystal ball question. If we looked at Latin America's future, let's say in 5 or 10 years' time, what do you think the digital landscape is going to look like?
That's a tough one, given all the challenges currently facing the region and the uncertainty both on the economic and the political sides. What I hope we will see is a renewed focus on the youth, as Mauricio was mentioning. I mean, I think that's where the future is, of course, by definition. But also that's currently one of the challenges the region faces. So you're mentioning. Dorothy's mentioning keypad literacy, and that's important, but it has to go way beyond that. And I think the lesson we learned from the pandemic was that most school systems in the region were not ready for digital education. Most students were not ready. No, as far as I'm aware, and colleagues can correct me if I'm wrong, but no country in the region currently, or let's say before the pandemic, had required that teachers become digitally literate and then pass that on to the students. Even Uruguay, which, as I mentioned, was one of the most advanced countries in the region, and certainly in terms of e-education, had an entire system, national system set up. Their online training to teachers was optional. The resources were there, the databases were there, the materials were there, but it was optional. So even in Uruguay, the teachers were not required to learn digital literacy, how to teach the students how to use those. You can't take a lesson plan that's going to be in person and just put it online. That doesn't work. We all learn that, even in the United States. But I think that was the challenge. The other challenge that we've seen time and again, and this predates the pandemic, was that the school systems, the education sector of the region, was not supplying what the private sector needed. So there were, very tragic cases really where, a large multinational company had come to a country in Central America, say, and had 20,000 software engineer jobs that could not be filled because they didn't exist in that particular country. So I think the whole, the private sector also needs to step up here, work with the government, communicate to the government what the needs are, where they see the needs in the next 5 to 10 years. That's going to be difficult to do because some of these jobs yet we don't even know today what they'll be in 5 years because the technology is moving so quickly. But we know they'll be there. We know they'll be in digital. We know that for sure. So I think that the governments also need to reach out to private sector to establish this kind of connection so that the private sector is feeding into the governments what the needs are, and the government's then able to respond and ensure that the educational systems are responding. So I'll end on my point on getting these the Latin American educational systems up to where they need to be for the digital age.
Right. Dorothy, did you have?
Crystal balling, I would tell you the one
Yeah.
thing we know is that we won't know what it will look like. I can give an example that when Disney first created a relationship with Apple to have content on the handheld, which was, it sounds ridiculous that was innovative, but it was really innovative because we had before content by appointment. You show up at 8 and you'll see this program. Suddenly you were going to be able to see it where you wanted, when you wanted on a handheld. So all of the engineers spent 6 months in secret working on creating the infrastructure for the iPad to put the content on the iPad. Went out didn't do well. And it didn't do well because no kid wanted to walk around with an iPad. They wanted it on their phone. And so we had to catch up and realize that actually, even though the executives in Burbank thought, why would you ever watch TV, content on a phone? The kids wanted to have it in their pocket. People wanted to have it in their purses. They didn't want to walk around with an iPad. So if predicting the way in which there'll be consumer adoption and the kinds of technologies that will drive some of the innovation, very hard to do. But I can guarantee that with the investment in broadband and the investment in infrastructure, it will take us there. So.
Okay. Well, we're just about out of time, so I'd like to thank all four of you, Dorothy, Rob, Ramon, and Janio, for this great discussion. As a journalist working in Latin America, I'm often reminded that I tend to take good communications for granted. I live in a capital city. I have good broadband access, but I travel a lot within the region. And as soon as I travel outside my comfort zone, whether it's in rural Colombia, or if I go to Venezuela, or I'm in the mountains of Peru, or the jungles of Ecuador, or wherever it is, I see local people who don't have that same good access to the internet. They don't have access to great streaming services, to e-government platforms, and you realize what a tremendous difference it makes to their lives and how much more difficult it makes their lives. So these are clearly really important issues that we've been discussing today. As I said at the start, I hope they haven't slipped down the political agenda because of the pandemic. They really need to kind of remain up there. And with that, I'll close. Before I close, I'd like to thank Millicom again and Mauricio Ramos for helping to make this event happen in collaboration with the Financial Times. And if you could, a round of applause for our four panelists here, Dorothy, Rob, Ramon, and Hania. Thank you very much.